we welcome Professor William Easterly, a distinguished American economist specializing in economic development. He currently serves as Professor of Economics at New York University, joint with Africa House, and a co-director of the New York University Development Research Institute. The author of The Elusive Quest for Growth, The White Man's Burden, and The Tyranny of Experts. He holds several senior fellowships and serves as an associate director of the Journal of Economic Growth. And with that, we welcome Professor Easterly. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to start from the beginning of your career. And prior to joining the world of academia, you worked from 1985 to 2001 at the World Bank as an economist and senior advisor of the Macroeconomic and Growth Division. How did you find working at the World Bank, and what did you learn that you think you've carried throughout your work as an academic?
Well, it's the World Bank is a wonderful job in many ways. I hope any of you looking for jobs will apply to it. Especially the research department was a great collection of wonderful development economists and still is today. I guess the main effect on me was kind of the exposure to the practical problems of developing countries and the efforts of the World Bank and other foreign aid agencies to help them get out of poverty. And to be honest, with me, it was kind of like a lot of excitement at the beginning. Really into it probably for the first 10 years of my career from 1985 to 1995. And really excited about working on countries like Ghana and the Gambia and Colombia and Russia. You know, it was really exciting to be in Russia as the Soviet Union was just ending. When I first went there in 1990, it was still the Soviet Union. And I was not an arch conservative anti-Soviet, but when I first went there, there's like, oh my God, it really did not work. Soviet economies really did not work. And that was, you know, sort of a big lesson for my career. But it was also a big lesson that our advice did not work that well either. That our advice on how to get our advice to the Russians, by our, I'm meaning the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, you know, the U.S. government, the Treasury Department of the U.S., the British Treasury Department. You know, we had these kind of naive notions that you can just flip a switch and transition immediately to a free market in Russia. And things did not work out that way. And we were really very naive. And I think in some ways I worry that we may have done more harm than good with our advice. I think that experience was sort of like the first awakening for me of the perils of experts having too much power and being too arrogant about their own knowledge of what's going to work. But of course, after we gave all this advice, Russia actually went into a severe depression that lasted about 10 years, and then really got out of it on their own efforts and not because of our advice. So then I guess the next step for me was I was also working in Africa after the Russia experience, and that was another area where it seemed like really both the World Bank's efforts and foreign aid in general was not working. There was a lot of foreign aid money going into Africa, but it did not seem to be reaching poor people and making their lives better. You know, I think you could say, you know, people usually say, oh, it winded up in the hands of corrupt governments, which is partly true. But I think it also, again, reflects the shortcomings of our advice as World Bank experts and foreign aid experts, that we really had too much. We had sort of like the sort of paternalistic vision that we knew best. And I think, you know, we really did not know best. And our advice during the period known as structural adjustment, when we were making loans conditional on them following our advice, things did not go well. Our advice did not usually get realized, and the results were not usually very good. And no, it was really only after the World Bank and IMF stopped attempting to dictate advice by force, using our loans as a weapon, that things started to get better in Africa. And then Africa started reforming on its own. And there were sort of homegrown economic reforms that liberated markets, liberated people, gradually shut down the most extreme violations of a stable economy, like extremely high inflation or extremely high punitive taxes on exports. And that was done really by African reformers' own efforts. And it was only after that that Africa started to grow, beginning about 1995. So that was a real eye opener for me. And that's really what led me to write The Elusive Quest for Growth, which in the end sort of helped get me out of the World Bank somewhat involuntarily. The World Bank was not super happy with what I wrote in the Elusive Quest for Growth. And it's like, maybe you should consider another possible job elsewhere. Maybe ask New York University if they would like to hire you. So that was sort of the end of my World Bank career.
You kind of preempted my next question, which was, why did you make the switch? But I guess you've answered it perfectly.
Well, I can say more about that if you want.
I guess
it really was about intellectual freedom of thought, freedom of academic research. So, I think that I had found that certain things were censored at the World Bank, that if I wanted to say some things critical of foreign aid or critical of the World Bank, that was going to be censored. Maybe somewhat understandably from their point of view, but I really did not want censorship. And I don't think anyone should have censorship in the development world. So that's really why I moved to academia.
Do you think that censorship that you're talking about still exists today, or do you think it's
Yeah,
something?
Yeah, I think it still does. I don't mean to say that it's not. I don't want to exaggerate. It's not that everyone at the World Bank is just mouthing some kind of party line. That's not true at all. I think the secret for people in the research department is to just sort of stay under the radar and write good articles for academic journals that don't make it out into kind of public debates. But yeah, it still exists if there is anything. I actually had a paper that was going to be issued as a World Bank working paper not that long ago, and there I once again found censorship. So it is still there, sadly enough. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you consider this quite a large hindrance to getting new ideas regarding economic development out into the world, or do you think that there are enough people who aren't involved in that who can still kind of speak out?
Yeah, it is a large hindrance, and yeah, it does worry me about the ability to have kind of free debates in the development world. I think one of the most obvious issues is that people in the development world, not only in the World Bank, but are really afraid that if anyone says anything critical of how foreign aid is working, that will hurt the funding for foreign aid, and that it might mean less resources for very desperate poor people who need the resources. And I sympathize with that, but it's really disabling to censor debates. The way I have seen it most recently is censoring debates about topics like democracy or criticizing authoritarian governments, criticizing US or UK foreign policy for giving aid to our allies in the war on terror. Those are kind of the criticisms of foreign aid that I find most interesting and persuasive at the moment. But those are really not allowed in the aid world. And it's not just the World Bank. I think people like Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, I think they don't want to fund critical voices that would criticize aid either. I think they're also engaged in some mild censorship because they're afraid that criticism will hurt the aid effort, which I think is kind of an ungrounded fear, because aid, I think, has turned out to be remarkably resilient to many changes in political regimes. So I think they've been trying to scare us into silence, and the scare was not really valid, and we should not have been silent. We should have been having an open debate about things like whether aid is working, whether democracy is a good thing, whether the US and UK are supporting authoritarian governments because of the war on terror. I think we should have been talking about those things.
Awesome. So obviously, this is quite a big trend in your work, the focus on the problems associated with international aid to developing nations. And one of the key areas that you criticize in your book, The Elusive Quest to Growth, is kind of these issues associated with debt relief. Can you briefly explain why you view debt relief as a form of foreign aid as so problematic?
Yeah, well, that's coming up again now, and and that's kind of illustrative that, and I was not the first to criticize debt relief. There was a development economist from the London School of Economics called P.T. Bauer, Lord P.T. Bauer, who in the 1960s and 70s was already criticizing debt relief and aid. And one of his sentences that I will paraphrase that I liked a lot is that unproductive aid leads to a demand for more aid to cancel the loans that finance the unproductive projects the first time. And so that's sort of the problem with debt relief, is it never forces you to kind of do an accounting that the aid, if the aid had worked, if it had really been productive, then poor countries and poor governments would have not had that much trouble paying the loans, because the aid loans would have yielded such a handsome productive return that the return would have enabled the debt to be serviced. Especially since aid loans are highly subsidized. There's basically made at a zero interest rate. So, it's not that difficult to repay loans at a zero interest rate if the aid is at all productive. But apparently the aid is not productive enough to repay the debt. And so we get into this sort of endless cycle of debt forgiveness. There was P.T. Bauer's generation of debt forgiveness. In the mid-90s, there was my generation of debt forgiveness. And now, once again, we're talking about debt forgiveness. The same countries, the same loans, the same lenders, sort of nobody is learning. And I think China is also learning now about how their aid loans were not productive enough, that they need to forgive their aid loans also. China is going to have to do debt relief also.
So additionally, in your book, The White Man's Burden, you describe kind of specific do-good or paternalistic missions of foreign aid as kind of an extension of previous colonial attitudes in the way they went about. And you've been quite fairly critical of economists like Jeffrey Sachs and other individuals who've kind of carried out these sort of ventures. And you make a distinction here between searchers and planners. Can you kind of delve into this distinction and why you're in such support of searchers, but quite against these planners?
Yeah, so planners are kind of based on the idea that there's some kind of possibility of a kind of centralized knowledge, centralized expertise that will guide the whole development effort, that will tell developing countries what exactly is the right thing to do. And then, once they say that solves the problem, because, then the answer, and that's fine. The problem with that is the planners, first of all, they're not really accountable to anyone. So they don't have that strong an incentive or to be as kind to them as possible. They're trying hard, they're good-hearted, but the overall system does not tend to kind of weed out the bad planners and reward the good planners, because they're not accountable to anyone. They don't get penalized for having their advice go badly wrong, like I was talking about earlier with Russia and Africa. And they don't get rewarded for having a great plan. So there's no way in which sort of the good and bad plans are distinguished from each other. And whereas, so there's sort of a knowledge problem that they don't have enough incentive to get it right. And they're also totally omitting the whole issue of who exactly is going to have the incentive to implement these answers once they announce what the answers are. So, who exactly is going to supply the bed nets and the antibiotics and the broadband connections once you say that those are the answers? So searchers is kind of, you can think of as a whole system of problem solving where consumers and individuals and voters are rewarded in a free society where they can elect their own leaders, and in a market they can choose which firms are meeting their needs. Those searchers in markets and democracy, they are motivating decentralized problem solvers, which I'll call searchers, to meet their needs, because any firm that meets their needs gets rewarded with more business and more profits. Any government that meets their needs gets rewarded with re-election and longer term in office. And a bad government or a bad firm, loses out and gets eliminated, because bad firms go out of business, bad governments don't get reelected. So that's sort of the the problem-solving system is what matters and not the availability of centralized experts. So it's the searchers are the individuals themselves who are seeking for their own answers, trying to find what they themselves are best at, trying to find what other agents are solving their own problems, and they get to say what solves their problem. So to give you one specific example, I mentioned broadband. That's sort of a typical centralized expert solution. There was actually a UN commission headed by the Rwandan dictator Paul Kagame, announcing that broadband was the answer and asking for a lot of funding to kind of universally connect the world's population to broadband. But a lot of skeptical researchers suggested that was not that productive a thing to do, is to invest in broadband. So it's not helpful to people who don't have electricity, people who don't have computers, to people who don't have computer training, don't have enough software. You can think of all the things that makes it not that appropriate a solution. There's actually one researcher that found that villages in India that were connected to broadband, he found the main effect was young men were playing video games after they got connected to broadband. And that's great that young men get to play video games. That's great. But that's probably not what they had in mind when they were thinking of broadband as a transformative development solution that would end global poverty. And to give you an alternative kind of searcher type solution, what actually has worked really well all around the world is the explosion of very cheap cell phones. So searchers, both entrepreneurs and consumers, they stumbled on the answer of cell phones, which was a lot better than the answer of broadband. So, cell phone subscribers in Africa now are greatly outnumber those in the US. The cell phone minutes are sold on kiosks on the streets. Even relatively poor people are buying cell phone minutes with very cheap cell phones. They use cell phones, farmers use cell phones to find customers. Fishermen use them to find which beach has the most demand for their fish when they come in out of sea. Traders use them to actually make financial transfers via the cell phone, using companies like M-Pesa in Kenya to make financial transfers. So that's a great example of sort of decentralized searcher type solution that was much better than the planner type solution.
So it kind of seems like there's a lot of evidence about why a lot of these planners sort of solutions are quite ineffective. Why then do you think that so many people continue to try them? Is it for some kind of internal kind of feel-good attitude, or do you think it's just a lack of knowledge on their part?
I think a feel-good attitude goes some way to explain it. Frankly, it's saying that you have the answer and having the answer sound kind of very appealing and plausible, like broadband. It's great for a public relations marketing campaign if you want to raise more funds for your NGO or for your aid agency. And have some cranky, grouchy guy like me say it doesn't work and say these vague things about how you need searchers and a decentralized problem-solving system. That just doesn't fit that well into a TED talk that would wow the audience and raise a lot of funds for an NGO. So I think that's part of the story. Things that sell well, are what do we mean by sell? Things that sell well mean they sell well to the donors, to the potential funders. So to give you another kind of silly little example, there was an initiative by one NGO in Africa to do a soccer ball that I'm forgetting the name. I think it was SockNet or something like that. That when the children kicked the soccer ball, the rotations of the soccer ball, thanks to ingenious engineering within the soccer ball, it would generate internal electricity as the kids were kicking the soccer ball. There was machinery inside the soccer ball that was like a little generator that was generating electricity as the kids were kicking the soccer ball around the field. And then at night, you could sort of plug in the soccer ball, the stored up electricity, you could plug in the soccer ball and kind of, power a reading light to do your schoolwork or something. So that sounded really good, and people loved this idea. And even President Obama, during his visit to Africa, was sort of tricked into kicking one of these soccer balls. So what's the reality on this? Well, the reality is, it turns out when you kick a mechanized soccer ball, it breaks down pretty quickly. That was the flaw in the design. And again, planners don't have a good way for accounting for realizing when there's a mistake and correcting the mistake. So that was the flaw. And that thing, the soccer ball, the miraculous electricity generating soccer ball, lasted much longer than it should have, because even from the beginning, people were saying, oh, it's not going to work. And yet it lasted because it was just such a great story for the NGO and for the funders. It's like in journalism, there's a saying that a story is too good to check. We don't want to check whether it's true. It's just too good a story to check. And that's sort of what we have to live with often in the aid world.
So I think, as well as your ideas, obviously, as you say, not necessarily selling as well as others, but you've also received quite a lot of criticism for them, notably from Mr. Sachs himself, who said you were often being overly pessimistic and ignoring past successes of foreign aid. How do you respond to these quite harsh allegations?
Oh, I don't think they're that harsh. I think Jeff Sachs and I have a friendly relationship, actually. But well, I'd say two things. First, I have never said that aid never works anywhere ever. Obviously there are success stories. Some of the big success stories, some of them are quite old, like the Green Revolution that led to big increases in yields and alleviated hunger. The elimination of smallpox and polio, those are big successes. More recently, there's been progress on access to clean water, expansion of antibiotics that have led to a big fall in infant mortality in poor countries. And, there's been progress against malaria thanks to mass distribution of malaria bed nets. So there are successes. As you can see, a lot of them are kind of in the health area. I think planning is kind of easier in the health area because, medical experts really do know what the answer is more than economists do. The other thing I would say about pessimism is it's not a question of optimism versus pessimism. It's more like, who are you being pessimistic about? So, the ones I'm pessimistic about are the aid experts and the aid agencies. The ones I'm optimistic about are poor people solving their own problems and homegrown reformers and advocates in poor countries, campaigning for solutions to their own problems. I'm very optimistic about them. And if I could be a little unkind and unfair to Professor Sachs, I would suggest with him it's the reverse. He's very optimistic about aid experts and not so optimistic about poor people solving their own problems. So, I think most of the progress in developing countries really has been homemade. There's been many countries that have gotten themselves on a path of kind of pretty good economic growth, some very high economic growth like China, or South Korea or Taiwan, or Africa, a more modest increase in economic growth, but still very good economic growth over the past 25 years in Africa. And that's led actually, this I think is a great number for optimists. This led to a big increase in the percent of the world's population that live in extreme poverty. If we define that as less than $2 a day, which is really extreme, that percent has fallen from about 30% in 1990 to less than 10% today. So, that's the kind of optimism that I would like to celebrate, but I think it's mainly because of people solving their own problems.
No, definitely. In terms of aid agencies, if it is so that you don't think that they necessarily have a role to play in debt relief or giving kind of this direct kind of planet aid that we've seen before, what role do you think, if any, aid agencies can play in kind of alleviating the suffering of some of the most poor people in the world?
To be honest, I'm not sure anymore. I guess my main reaction is not to say they should disappear or they should do this or that. It's more that I have sort of wondered more and more over time why all of us spend so much time on the issue of what is the role of aid agencies. They really are a pretty small part of the picture. For example, the amount of aid going to Africa is, a few percent of Africa's GDP, whereas the amount of migrant remittances and foreign direct investment going to Africa is like twice as large as that. And Africa is the most aid-intensive region. So in the rest of the world, aid is pretty much non-existent or minuscule as a percent of countries' income. So, why are we spending so much time agonizing about this very small part of the picture, why are we not spending more time talking about what is, I think, the largest part of the picture, which is, again, I think, mainly the homegrown efforts of poor people. And I guess I have a possible answer for that. I think we're all in the West, we're a little bit narcissistic. We want ourselves to be the star of the story. We want to talk about what we are doing well, or some other people want to talk about what we are doing badly and kind of like obsess about our own role in the whole story. When our own role is sort of like really a pretty minor player. We're sort of like one of those, you know, character actors in a movie that appears in one scene and says a few lines of speech and is, you know, totally dwarfed by the leading stars of the movie. That's sort of like what we are as aid actors.
No, I think that's a very excellent analogy in terms of understanding it. In your book, Tyranny of Experts, you kind of argue for this refocusing on individual freedoms of the poorest, of people in the poorest nations. And that's kind of what you were talking about before. Can you kind of explain how you think this gets kick-started? Like, what is it? Is it just by pure chance, or do you think there's something that grows that eventually begins this kind of process?
Well, I hate to sound repetitive. I think once again, it's a story of, you know, not that much role for Western efforts to promote freedom in poor countries, and with one exception I'll come back to in a moment, and a gigantic role for you know, homegrown activists who campaign for their own rights and their own freedom. I mean, I think you know, people who there are good databases these days that keep track of things like democratic status and the number of political protests advocating for democracy. So democracy has went up a lot in the 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall and kind of spread of democracy through Latin America and Africa. You know, now it's sort of gone, the past 15 years, democracy has sort of stagnated and maybe going down slightly in both in poor countries and maybe in rich countries. But the good news offsetting that is that when political scientists measure the number of protests for the sake of political freedom, they're really exploding all over the place. You know the well-known ones like Hong Kong, but they're really exploding all over the place. They're like, you know, it's the data series that I saw was the number of protests are sort of at an all-time high. At least a third of countries have protests in favor of democracy or freedom or against corruption or against unaccountable government. You know, every year about a third of countries have these protests. So that's just remarkable how much effort poor people are making for their own freedom. So I said there is one exception about the role of the West, and that I think is curbing the negative role of the West. I think the West has often been a negative force for the sake of freedom because, as I mentioned before, there's this tendency for foreign aid to go to allies of the US and UK in the war on terror. And, you know, the kind of allies that are useful for the war on terror are usually very authoritarian dictators, somewhat corrupt, who can be bought off to be good allies for the US. Like, you know, Uganda, for example, that has troops in Somalia fighting al-Shabaab and gets a lot of aid despite high levels of dictatorship and corruption in Uganda with Museveni. And so that's an example of how I think there is something for us in the West to do, which is try to rein in our own governments and say, we don't want our money, we don't want our own governments that we freely elect to be doing things that hurt the freedom of other people, that support autocracy and oppression against other people, especially against poor people. And so protesting against our own government's actions in rich countries, I think that's what we should be doing if we want to spread the cause of global freedom.
You talk quite a bit about democracy. Do you consider democracy one type or another as a prerequisite for economic development?
In the long run, yes. It's not I mean, there obviously are examples of countries that have been very authoritarian, have had periods of very high economic growth, like China is currently. China, I think, was mainly benefiting for a long time from a huge increase in kind of economic freedom, which did result in more personal freedom for people to participate in, you know, choosing their own occupations and participating in markets. But China is obviously not at all democratic. But that's one example. But in the long run, there are many, many more examples of democratic countries that have become rich. Of course, that's what matters in the long run: who becomes rich. That's the end. That's the bottom line. And most of the countries that have become rich have been democracies. Now, I have to say this is not the greatest moment to be talking about how wonderful democracy is. We're really in a very troubled period for democracy, and that's not that unusual. Democracy does go through crises. And it went through a big crisis in the 1930s with the rise of fascism, and it's not that bad now. But there has been the last few years been pretty horrible for the cause of democracy around the world. So yeah, democracy is far from perfect. It goes through crises. It can be very badly flawed, but I think it's better than other systems. And in the long run, it is associated with much more, not only material prosperity, but also just in respecting the everyday rights of people, which is really an end in itself. People do not want to be put in jail or tortured by corrupt officials or censors who don't allow them to speak their minds and write what they think, and allow freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Those are ends in themselves. So, it's not that it's not that we only value democracy because we think it's a means to an end. We value it because freedom is really an end in itself for most people. Most people around the world think that way. Nobody wants to be tortured. People do want human rights for themselves. They're not as passionate about human rights for other people, but almost everyone wants human rights for themselves.
No, I think the last thing I want to talk about before we move on to more topical discussions and applying your theory and ideals to those is when you talk a lot about individual kind of refocusing on individual freedom and starting from searches, how would you respond to kind of criticisms that this is a view of kind of letting the West off for kind of the damage that they've caused?
Oh, well, I'm very sympathetic to the view that the West has done a lot of damage. I'm actually working on another project at the moment for the next book that will be about the history of colonialism as a way of thinking about development. And development was used, the idea of development was used in the past to justify really horrific things, not just colonialism, but even slavery was, the advocates of slavery claimed that they were acting in the material interests of the slaves, which is, even if you think that is nonsense, what was most important is that what slavery and colonialism was so good for the people they were supposing to help, why was such extreme force and coercion necessary to bring them these alleged benefits? I think that issue continues to exist in a less extreme form today. So that's, again, why I'm so upset about this sort of, I don't know if the right word is kind of neo-imperialism of the US and UK, trying to impose nation building on places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and then supporting the autocrats that we were talking about earlier. So, the best thing they can do, I think, to correct their own past, the West's own past oppression is just stop oppressing now. Stop the oppression now. Have the oppression end once and for all. And, it's also, I am also sympathetic to the idea that there should be maybe some kind of financial transfers that makes up for the damage that was done in the past. I'm very sympathetic to that idea in theory, but as we've been talking about with aid, it's very difficult to do that well. And particularly it's not been done well, I think, because if that was really supposed to be compensation for the evils of paternalism and colonialism done by the West in the past, why is that aid money still controlled by the West? Why is the West still in charge of dispersing that aid money and deciding who gets it and what it's spent for? Why not just give some direct cash transfers to a bunch of poor people around the world to compensate for past damage, and not have the West in charge of running the World Bank and running the International Monetary Fund, running USAID, running the Department for International Development in the UK, having those agencies decide who's going to get the aid and what it's going to be spent for. To me, that's a kind of paternalism that is still a kind of echo of colonialism.
I definitely agree, and I think that's a very insightful and probably needed kind of view of aid. And I think it's great that a lot of your work has brought that into kind of the sphere for discussion. Moving slightly into current affairs and applying your theories there, what are your thoughts in terms of Trump's White House agenda for foreign aid and development? And how do you see the Biden administration differing from this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very topical. I guess the thing that surprises me watching aid, not just with this move that might happen right now, but watching aid over the years, is it changes a lot less than you might. It doesn't change as much as you might think when there are big changes in regime. So, we've had major changes in regime just since the year 2000, from, George W. Bush to Obama to Trump, now back to Biden. So far, I've been struck by kind of how similar the aid regime is over all those years. What USAID is doing does not actually change as much as you might think over those years. The amount of aid doesn't change that much. The sort of neocon approach to nation building and military intervention doesn't change that much. And I think that will still be alive in the new Biden administration, much to my distress. I'm not making any sweeping partisan comment about the shift in general. I'm just observing it in my own little narrow field. In my own little field, I'm kind of always surprised just how it makes a lot less difference than people think it does. Because really there is sort of even if there isn't in other areas, in the aid area, I think there really is kind of a stable kind of bureaucracy and set of experts and set of supporters in both parties. There's kind of bipartisan support for aid in the US. And so it really proves to be remarkably resilient to what otherwise are really drastic and sometimes horrific changes in regimes. But the aid is kind of an exception to that. So,
my final question, I think we've spoken quite a lot about the US and the UK and kind of the West providing aid and kind of development help. But I'm kind of interested to talk about the alternative forms of development, of kind of aid and development offered by countries such as China, such as that we see in the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm kind of interested how you think this plays into your theory and where you see this fitting, or if you see this as a kind of a positive form of foreign direct investment.
Yeah, so I think one of the most common comment I hear about Chinese aid is that, oh, this is so terrible because the Chinese are not going to respect human rights when they give the aid. And it's like, my reaction to that was, and you thought the Western aid was respecting human rights before the Chinese came along? What world were you looking at? I didn't think the Western aid was respecting human rights. So why do you think the Chinese are much worse when they're also not respecting human rights? So that, that's the most common thing I hear said about Chinese aid. And I also mentioned earlier how another kind of ironic parallel is the Chinese are kind of learning the same lessons that earlier aid donors learned, that unproductive aid usually leads to loans that cannot be repaid and have to be forgiven. I think it sounds like that's starting to happen with Chinese aid also.
Awesome. Well, with that, let's move on to some audience questions. Please remember to keep submitting your questions through the Q&A function, and remember to include your name and college so that I can credit you. The first question comes from Jacob Murphy from Magdalen College, who says, what role does local business and local entrepreneurship have in development? And what do you think is the best approach to support local businesses and entrepreneurship in developing economies?
Yeah, so I think local business has an enormous role to play in alleviating poverty in poor countries. And, this is an area where there are really many, many great success stories, and a lot of them consist of really being able to participate in the global market in a way that when you can access the markets of rich countries, and that can be a powerful way of having local businesses lift people out of poverty. So, you get sort of unusual specializations going in, like, cut flowers are produced in Colombia for sending to the US. Colombians are producing flowers in the morning, and they're put on the plane, and they're reaching New York by midday, and then I can buy flowers for my wife and make my wife happy, and support Colombian flower growers back in Colombia. And this is happening on that industry is sort of happening all over the world. There's growing flowers in Thailand for Japan, and Ecuador for Russia, in Kenya for the Netherlands, and so on. And so, that just multiply those kind of stories by about 1,000-fold. So you're getting gourmet coffee grown in Burundi for rich country markets. You're getting these kind of unexpected specializations, like there's something going on that I've noticed in the trade data that for some reason Egypt has really the market on exporting ceramic toilets to Italians, to Italy. I have no idea why that is, but just shows you when you create enough opportunity by giving access to the global market, you create so many possibilities for finding things to do that will really turn out to be real major income generating enterprises for poor people. So, the main thing that I think the rich countries can do is just really keep their markets open wide for imports from poor countries to come in. And of course, that really was one big change that happened, in the recent administration, was this kind of turn against open markets. The feeling of that, anyone who is any enterprise based in a poor country was somehow sort of robbing the U.S. and that U.S. should just produce everything for itself and not import anything from anywhere else, which I think is just a ridiculous concept of what's good for the U.S. That there are lots of things that we're not good at doing, and there are other things we are good at doing. And the great secret of economics is gains from specialization. Do what you were good at doing and don't do what you're not good at doing. Autarky for nations is like autarky for an individual. I read a interesting book about a guy who tried to make his own toaster. he spent like thousands of hours, thousands of dollars, a year and a half flying around the world to collect raw materials, and then made a very flawed toaster that barely made the bread lukewarm. And it cost him, all this effort. But he could have just gone to Walmart in the US and bought a toaster from China for $6. That's sort of what it means to participate in world trade for US consumers. And for China, that opportunity to export has been a huge vehicle out of poverty in China. So, I think that's a win-win situation for everyone. But obviously, that's not the current fashion. And kind of in either party in the US is that both parties seem to have turned against trade as a vehicle for the well-being of both rich and poor countries.
Moving to a question from Tony Thompson-Starkey from Queen's College. They say, you've talked about mistakes of World Bank programs in Russia in the early days. How would you see the current emphasis on SDGs, especially in the difficult economic times we're living in right now? Isn't piling additional demands on foreign investors, and with automation and roboticization in core markets, are we not making investment in emerging and developing countries less attractive by this?
So let me say something about SDGs and then say something about robots. So the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, it is true that they impose, they try to dictate what a lot of people will be doing. So I think they're once again a delusion of how supposed centralized expert planners can transform the whole world economy. And part of that, I think what you're referring to is they would kind of like make businesses operate in this, what they're calling socially responsible way, which I think the UN gets to decide what is socially responsible. So, and then they're also trying to dictate a lot of other things that poor people are doing by, having centralized kind of sustainable development goals. The good news about this is I don't think anyone outside of development circles is paying much attention to the SDGs. I don't think they have any enforcement mechanism whatsoever, which is, it's a big flaw if you think that the SDGs are the secret to any global poverty. It's not a flaw if you think they're not such a good idea after all. And it's kind of good news that the enforcement is not going to be so great. I'm sorry, I forgot what the other part of the question was.
it related to, it says, especially in difficult economic times we are living in right now, isn't piling additional demands on foreign investors, and with automation and robotization and core
robots. Yeah. So, you know, I have a good friend who's also a great development economist named Lant Pritchett, who's actually teaching at Oxford now, who has made a great point. I've heard him make a great point about robots, that there must be something really crazy going on, that that we're trying to replace unskilled labor with robots, when actually the most abundant thing in the world today is unskilled labor. And the most valuable way to get poor people out of poverty is to allow unskilled labor to do their thing and produce, flowers and coffee and toilets for Italians and cars and textiles and, all those, and farm products and all those things that could be manufactured with and, created with unskilled labor and sent to rich countries. So it's because rich countries are starting to be so protectionist that they're forced to rely on their own expensive unskilled labor, and they're starting to restrict immigration so much that they're cutting off their own access to people who'd be willing to work, immigrants that would be willing to work instead of being replaced by robots. And so I think I kind of agree with Lant. I think robots are just this kind of bizarre distortion going on, that if in a more free world in which the ability to trade was more respected, there'd be no need for massive investments in robots. There's plenty of unskilled labor to go around.
Awesome. We have a question here from Niraj Rao from the Said Business School, which is where our MBA Masters Business Administration are based. And that they asked, what can organizations like the World Bank, IMF, and other multilaterals do with respect to the COVID-19 crisis, particularly on equality of access to COVID-19 vaccines once they're available? You're not in favor of loans and debt forgiveness, yet the countries have been sharply affected from an economic perspective due to the crisis and may not be able to afford vaccines. Yet borrowing has gone up exponentially. Ironically, development banks are counter-cyclical to regular business cycles. They're doing really well. What advice would you offer these organizations?
Well, my main reaction is, I think I've observed a lot of people kind of opportunistically rushing in to say things about COVID-19, including a lot of us who don't know that much, are not that well qualified to talk about anything to do with COVID-19. And I think I'm definitely in the latter category. I think there are too many people claiming to be experts on how to solve COVID-19 right now in the world, and I don't want to join that number. I think that's a wonderful question. I hope you can find somebody good who can answer it. The only thing I would say is, I've already said that aid has been more effective in the health area, when you really do know a planner really is more likely to know the right answer. So I think once there is a good vaccine, there's obviously a strong case for subsidizing that vaccine very heavily all around the world, including for poor people in every way possible. So that's I'm saying kind of something very obvious, I think, but that's just because the obvious is the only thing I feel qualified to say at the moment.
I think that's a very humble approach to the question. I think many people would have rattled off something not knowing about it. We have one question here from Eba from Wolfson College, who asks, I would like to hear your point of view of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Do you believe it will work?
So free trade is also a great idea within Africa. I think there have been really absurd borders that were left over from the colonial era between adjoining neighbors within Africa. It's been, and that has really been one factor that has really held back the development of Africa. If you think, as I do, that trade is a huge vehicle for making development happen. So anything that can make borders kind of easier to cross with fewer transaction costs as far as customs fees, as far as paperwork, as far as corruption that might happen at the border. Those are all great things for kind of promoting more trade and development in Africa.
Awesome. We have a question here from Samira from Pembroke College, who asks, is there a trade-off between showing people the truth about ineffective aid and inciting so much cynicism that people cease to give aid at all?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That's a great question. That indeed is, like you said earlier, Geneva, that's sort of a criticism that I've always gotten throughout my career. And, I guess I really would be worried if people like me did have a huge effect on causing aid to be severely cut. And if that happened, there probably would be cuts to programs that really were useful and helpful to poor people. And I would be sad if that happened. First of all, I'd say there's no sign that has been happening. There's no sign that aid critics have any effect on the aid budget. So let me reassure you that no matter how cynical I or anyone else is, it's not going to have any effect on the aid budget. And like I said earlier, aid has bipartisan support. It's remarkably resilient. But the second thing I would say is, you are in a university, I'm in a university. I really do believe in academic freedom. I really do believe academics, above all, should not censor themselves because they fear that their ideas might affect some policy in some way. Any kind of censorship is kind of bad for, not just bad for academia, it's bad for the world. Just think of how important was it to have free academic debate, to have all the major, technological and medical inventions that we have in our world, to make progress on issues of public policy like, fighting smallpox or getting good sanitation to eliminate cholera from the 19th century, for example. That kind of freedom of debate is also, I think it's also useful in the aid world. It does kind of ask aid agencies to behave better and to be more accountable and be more effective. And if they listen to that and they are more effective, that's the best way to hold on to their funding, to kind of persuade people that they are being more effective, and then they will have a secure funding, which, by the way, I think they have secure funding anyway, even if they're not effective. So I think we can all relax and continue to have our aid debate as much as we want. I don't think anybody will be affected by it.
We have probably time for about two more questions. So we have one again from Tony Thompson-Starkey from Queen College, who asks, you're somewhat critical of development aid by the West. How would you see development banks such as the KfW of Germany, the AFD of France, or the JICA of Japan that facilitate companies investing and thus bringing jobs and knowledge to these countries?
Over the years, I have done kind of different kinds of rating exercises on different aid agencies, bilateral and multilateral. And, there is some variation. There are some that are better than others. I don't really have up-to-date information on that to give you an exact answer to your question about those agencies, but it's certainly true that they're not all alike and some are better than others. For me, if you're just talking about supporting business, the thing that supports business the most is to have people having the incentive to invest in their own businesses, and having foreign investors have the incentive to invest. So, one of the biggest forces for business in developing countries has been the huge surge in foreign direct investment and in capital flows to poor countries, and also the freeing up of domestic lending markets within poor countries. For example, it used to be common in poor countries that there are very severe controls on interest rates in banks. And when there was if there was something like a 40% rate of inflation because inflation was a problem and the control on the interest rate was that interest rates could not be higher than 5%, then savers were getting a minus 35% return on their savings. They did not want to save in banks. Then banks had no money to lend to business. So the best thing you can do in that situation, which indeed a lot of homegrown reformers have done in most of the world, is just remove those kind of extreme interest rate controls. And then there is a much greater flow of savings and investment domestically into business. So those are the kind of things that I think matter the most, and frankly, not the actions of aid agencies.
Awesome. Well, we're time for one last question, which comes from Kabir from Exeter College, who asks, To what extent is development aid a prerequisite for market liberalization?
I think in the past, during the era of structural adjustment in the 80s and 90s, the World Bank and the IMF tried to make it a prerequisite in the sense that the World Bank would only give loans to a poor country if the poor country agreed to liberalize their markets. And I think that was bad because I don't believe ever, and even if I think something is a good idea, like I mainly think market liberalization is a good idea, but I never think that good ideas should be imposed by coercion, by force, by threatening to withhold loans. Again, that sounds very much like a kind of colonial era, kind of paternalistic policy that you try to force someone else to do what you think is good for them. I really don't believe in that idea at all. So I don't think aid should be a prerequisite to market liberalization as used as a kind of coercion by World Bank or anyone else. And I think the good news, not just with economic freedom, but also with political freedom is, the people who are best at fighting for the rights of poor people are poor people themselves. And that's the good news around the world today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. That's all that we have time for this evening. Thank you so much, Professor Eastley, for joining us.
Thank you, Geneva. Thanks to all of you.
I've learned so much and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again, Professor Eastley, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thanks to all of you. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.